Hey Rob.
1 second. Hey, how's it going?
Good.
Yeah, so now the PRs um for pending is merged, right? And we just have to do IDs now.
Yeah, I'm actually putting the finishing touches on it right now. Um,
Oh,
as
great,
we,
awesome.
um, I didn't, do we have, a set agenda or are we just, touch base?
Yeah, there's no set agenda.
Okay,
Um, I'll give it another minute to see if anyone else joins, but I just wanted to check in on that pretty much.
cool. Okay. I'm wondering I mean, I'm not, I mean, I'm wondering meaning what the next, like where we are. I mean, I know obviously it's good to put these PRs in just because it improves based on what was on main already. But from what I recall, the response format itself was basically, I don't know, accepted, ratified, welcomed by the main working group. From what I recall, but the question and the pending question was about early and deferred execution. Um, and that was I feel like we say this about all sorts of things, but that was like the last main blocker that I know of, right? Is that your understanding, like in terms of like where we are overall?
Well, I feel like that we don't really need to make a decision on that. Well, yeah, but what I mean is I think that we should get your changes into GraphQL.js and publish that. Then we can get feedback. So that has early execution. We can get feedback and iterate on how we want to handle delayed execution. And then the next step, I think, is I want to work on the spec changes. And I feel like the delayed versus early execution, we should like figure it out with like specific spec changes, I think. Because I think it's hard to like, because we said like we want to cover all the cases, but we also want it to be simple. So I think we just need to like iterate on the how we're writing the spec rather than
Uh-huh.
like make a decision now and decide that's what we're doing.
Um,
But
okay.
let me know
Uh,
if you guys disagree.
um, oh, let's see who else is here. Oh, Benji's here. Hi, Benji.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, good. Yeah, sorry about that. Zoom decided it needed to be uninstalled and fully reinstalled, so I'm a little bit late joining.
Yeah. We were just talking about Yakov's PRs to get the new response format are merged, and that's everything except for ID at this point. He's working on that. And once we get that in place, I want to ask Iman to publish a new alpha so people can start using it. And then we were talking about that now that PR does early execution. That's what's going to be there for now. We can get feedback and then start iterating on options on how to support both types of execution if it's needed, or if everyone comes back and says it's a bad idea, then we'll just only do delayed execution. But I just want to get something out there, and that's what we have now.
Cool. Good to get something out there that we can test.
Yeah. So I don't really have an agenda other than that. Just keeping things moving on getting the new response format in GraphQL.js. And then once that's in place, I'm going to start focusing attention on the spec edits. And then I think once we have some, like my takeaway from the meeting was that we want to be flexible and we also want to keep the spec simple. So I think that it makes sense rather than like decide right now what we're going to do, but like get something written down and then iterate on it.
That makes sense. We received some feedback recently. I'm just trying to load up the discussion now.
Yeah, that was about the IDs.
It was about everything, I think, in the new response format. It's from Jaffer.
Yes.
Yeah, last week. And it related to not just the IDs, but like broadly everything, like the repetition and all sorts, I think. Have you had enough time to look into what Jaffa is proposing as like the alternative solution?
Not fully. I like briefly read through it and I saw that you guys had a few messages back and forth. I'm not sure exactly where it was left off. But yeah, I'll read through it again. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, I find myself torn in general on this issue because, as Jaffa quite rightly points out, generally in GraphQL, you write your query and you get the response back in that same shape, right? But defer and stream kind of break that. Not the current version. The current version that's out there doesn't break that, but instead breaks a whole bunch of other stuff in other ways. And also gives you this request multiplication issue. Like you can already make inefficient GraphQL queries, but with just stream and defer, you can make incredibly inefficient GraphQL queries. And it's a case of like walking that line between, do we want to provide something that is simple and straightforward, that doesn't really need much in the way of tooling to support, much like GraphQL without stream and defer, right? At the moment, you can use that in like a command line utility, like just string in JQ along with a bash script and curl or something. Whereas with stream and defer, but certainly with what I propose with the like pendings and the so on and so forth, you actually do need some level of caching there. So I think it's a good point, and it is also hinting at what Matt Mahoney's been saying all this time, which is like, can I just use the data? And no, I can't because I need this extra stuff. But equally, if we just go with the simple exposure of the data, we're going to be potentially opening ourselves up to huge multiplication of the data in memory. So there'll be a lot of serialization and deserialization costs, both on server and client, I think, for data that is broadly the same. So it is definitely it's one of those issues where I think we need to have wide buy-in to do what we're currently proposing. So I think the right way to go forward is to do what we're currently proposing, and then see what the feedback is and see whether it's worth the cost, if the cost outweighs the benefit or not.
Yeah,
I personally think that the costs of doing this are massively outweighed by the benefits. I'm very concerned about if we don't do something like this, the resulting patterns or the vulnerabilities that could occur because of not doing this more efficiently could be quite significant, especially keeping in mind that GraphQL is designed for the client. And as much as anything, that means it's designed for mobile clients. And mobile clients don't have the most RAM. So giving them ridiculously huge objects to destructure in memory seems unwise.
yeah. So I think that, I mean, I don't think that there's a way to have it all, right? You know, I think we would have figured that out by now if there was, and we tried. So let's move forward with getting a working version out there and see how it's received?
Well, looking more into, I'm just looking over Jafar's examples now, and broadly, what they seem to be doing is just changing the ID into using like the path and label,
Right.
which we've discussed, I think, quite a few times. I'm not sure that it honestly brings that much value.
You have the issue where the same field is referenced by multiple labels. And
Yeah.
um,
But you could make that a responsibility of, right. So if you have a unique, you can make it the server's responsibility to have a unique pairing of path and label. And if a second defer happens with that same match, then the server just effectively increments a counter but doesn't send that through to the client, arguably. Sorry,
well,
unless I missed your point.
Yeah, no, like two separate defers, two different labels, the same field inside both defers.
Yeah, no, you're right. That is another thing that the IDs solve by grouping them together.
It's not necessarily the IDs, because it's even, I think that might even be a little confusing the way we have the ID in the subpath, because it makes it seem like that field is part of that ID and only that ID when it's not. It's just the one that gives you the shortest subpath.
Mm-hmm.
So that was kind of why I posted that example where, like, I think a version where we don't use IDs at all means that we just have a full path on the incremental fields, and then pending and completed has both path and label. And or maybe maybe it does make sense if you put an array of labels onto the incremental, but then you could just read the data as it comes in and not have to, you don't have to know what the ID is. You don't have to read pending to figure out the ID before you could process the incremental payload. That's the difference.
Yeah, the risk being, of course, that the paths can get quite long quite fast. So it's
Yeah.
still giving you this large object in memory. And I think for defer, that's not honestly a big deal at all. And I think over the wire is also not a big deal because, again, like gzip compression or whatever will handle that repetition just fine. The issue is in memory. And when it comes to something like stream, where suddenly we might have like 100 nodes all repeating this path, suddenly the idea of compressing it down to ID colon 27 rather than path and then 6 path segments could be quite a big saving in memory. Or maybe not.
It's mostly that the client, when they're building the incremental, the fully reconciled object has a pointer to where the path goes for the ID, so they don't need to keep traversing the object. That's the main benefit, right?
That's certainly one of them, yeah.
I feel like the amount of memory for the path is, I was talking to Yakov about that, and it seems like we can't really free it on the server because we need to hold on to it to report errors when things are being executed. But on the client, you could. I'm not sure how significant it is, but the pointer into the location seems like the strongest argument for the ID.
Yeah, and the server is going to be best placed to know where those pointers would need to be rather than making the client just sort of guess at where to do it.
Yeah.
Then again, the client could just do it every time it sees a particular path combo. But yeah, it's gonna be more efficient for the server to indicate it.
If you're a client, you see a bunch of pendings come in, they all have different paths. You can store like a map somewhere of the pointers of where those locations go into the final object, or your normalized store, I'm assuming. But then when the incrementals come in, if they have the long path, you have to kind of like at each segment of the path, check if you have one of those pointers. Whereas if it's the ID, you could look it up immediately.
Yeah. And you also know very cleanly when you can release it as well.
Yeah. All right, I'll read through this again and I'll leave another reply, and I'll explain why we don't have label on incremental and why we want to have the IDs, and then I'll see what he comes back with, if there's anything.
Yeah. I haven't read the latest post from Jaffa or Yakov on that thread either, so I need to catch up on that too.
One thing,
Cool, that's all I had.
one thing on that was that I think it clarified for me a little bit that that the IDs are not going to be useful to the client on their own without the label, unless the client is using like the type name hack to use their own labels within the response. So meaning, so I think Jafar was talking about a case in which there were multiple defers at the same path, and the client suggesting that maybe the client would want to know when they've all completed, because the client can't actually distinguish. It sees that defer 1 is completed, defer 2 and defer 3, but it doesn't know. It doesn't know without a label what those defers actually are, assuming again that it's not using that type name hack. So that the defer seems to be assuming that it might be optimal then to not send the completed notification until the client can actually meaningfully distinguish, meaning until all the defers at that path have resolved. And basically what that sort of my understanding of what that means is basically that's equivalent to merging defers that have no label or the same label, as a similar case, but specifically they're merging defers that have no label. And we initially, we suggested that before we had all this, this better way of reducing the response size. We had brought up that idea, and here we have it again. So I just I think it makes sense what that suggestion, and I think the answer to that is, well, if we do merge the defers there, then nobody can use that. Then anybody who is using that type name hack or type name tool as opposed to labels will be blocked, because they'll be blocked until all of the defers at that path have been. So that would be like the argument against that. But I just wanted to sort of highlight it, and because it sort of clarified for me that the ID is not necessarily useful on its own without the label or without that type name hack being used.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Yakov. And I recall, I think it was me that originally proposed merging them all together, and that was for the sake of efficiency. It was to make it so we could execute it quicker, and also so that it wasn't like an attack vector. But since we've come up with, as you say, the more efficient ways to solve this, we know that there are problems or situations where people would not want those defers to merge, and requiring that they add labels or different labels in order to achieve that is one option. But I don't think that it should be necessary. I think if a user explicitly states them as separate defers, then they are separate defers. That would be more natural for the user, I think, in most cases. So I think what we've landed on there is probably the right thing. But I appreciate you sharing your interpretation of Jafar's point there.
Yeah, I think as we see people's feedback, we sort of we can sort of get like the teaching points, in order of like why we did it this way and so forth. And I think people will hopefully appreciate the choices we made.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, so while we were here, I finished off that ID and subpath PR, and there's also the one about the weak maps that was extracted, but I think it doesn't pay really to look at that until we have some benchmarking to see if it actually really saves anything, and then we can get into the weeds on it. But the ID and subpath one's ready.
All right, great. I'll review that today.
And just from a very quick glance at the first line in it, the ID you've marked as optional. Should it be optional?
I think I marked it as optional only. I think I intended it because maybe I think because the path itself was optional, because maybe I'm not sure. Let me take another look. I think the path was optional. Let me take a look.
Subpath is definitely optional, but I think that ID isn't, assuming that the incremental defer result is being used how I would expect it to be. I think every single one of those would have an ID. Even an error one would need to know where the error came from. I think I'd have to look it up though, to be sure.
No, I think you're right. I'm just looking at it now, and I'm wondering why the path was optional in the previous version. I think you are right though, that it should not be optional here. So let me hack at it. So maybe a Rob, I'll post when if I've figured anything more out on that. But I think you're right, Benji. Thanks.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks for raising that, Yakov, and for all of both of your work. And I guess chat again on Monday.
Yeah. All right. I'll see you then.
Thank you.